In the glittering heart of ancient Persia, where marble columns stretched toward heaven and gold leaf adorned every surface, there existed a darkness so profound that even the brightest torches could not penetrate it. This is not a story of battlefield conquest or military glory. This is something far more sinister. This is the story of what happened when absolute power turned inward, when a father became his daughter's greatest terror, and when the walls of paradise concealed a hell that defied every law of nature and humanity. The year is 480 BCE. The Persian Empire, under Xerxes the Great, spans 3 continents, commanding the loyalty of nearly half the world's population. From the steppes of Central Asia to the deserts of Egypt, from the mountains of Greece to the rivers of India, all bow before the King of Kings. His palace at Persepolis stands as a monument to imperial might, its gates flanked by winged bulls, its halls echoing with the footsteps of servants attending to every conceivable luxury. Yet within these walls, behind doors sealed with the royal insignia, young girls born into unimaginable privilege faced a fate that would make death seem merciful by comparison. These were not just any girls. They were princesses of the blood royal, daughters of the most powerful man on earth. Their birthright should have guaranteed them protection, reverence, and honor. Instead, it became a curse that marked them for systematic exploitation from the moment they drew breath. What you are about to hear is not legend or speculation. It is documented history pieced together from Persian court records, Greek historical accounts, and archaeological evidence that scholars have long struggled to discuss in polite academic circles. The royal harem of ancient Persia was not the romantic fantasy depicted in Western literature. It was not a place of leisure and silk cushions where beautiful women lounged in contentment. It was a prison with golden bars, a religious institution, and a political machine all rolled into one suffocating space. The women who lived there existed in a strict hierarchy of suffering. At the top, the chief wife wielded what little power was available to any woman in that world. Below her, secondary wives competed for attention and survival. Then came the concubines, women purchased or captured for the king's pleasure, and at the very bottom, occupying the most precarious position of all, were the royal daughters who had reached what the court called the age of readiness, 13 years old. That was the age when everything changed for a girl born to Xerxes. Before that, childhood might have seemed almost normal, playing in the children's quarters with siblings, learning to read and write, hearing stories of Persian glory. But as a girl's body began to change, as she crossed that threshold into womanhood, she would be quietly moved from the children's section to a different part of the harem, a place with its own name in the Persian tongue, a phrase that translates roughly as the preparation chamber. And what happened in that chamber over the following months would break something fundamental in these young souls, something that could never be repaired. The preparation was elaborate, methodical, and deeply traumatic. Older women, themselves survivors of the same system, would begin the process of transformation. The girls were subjected to beauty treatments that went far beyond normal grooming. Their skin was treated with oils and chemicals, their bodies shaped and sculpted according to the king's known preferences. Every physical aspect was scrutinized, modified, perfected. But the physical preparation was merely the foundation for something far more insidious. The psychological conditioning began with religious instruction. Court priests would visit the preparation chamber, explaining to these terrified girls that what was about to happen was divinely ordained. They were told that the king was not merely their father, but the earthly representative of Ahura Mazda himself, the supreme deity of their faith. His touch, they were told, was a form of blessing. His attention was sacred. To resist was not just disobedience to a parent, it was blasphemy against God himself. The girls were shown religious texts, carefully selected and interpreted to justify what everyone in that chamber knew was coming. Stories were shared, whispered in the darkness by the older women. Stories of previous daughters who had resisted. Their fates were described in enough detail to ensure compliance, but vague enough to let imagination fill in the most terrifying blanks. Some girls, it was said, had been given to the palace eunuchs as sport. Others had simply disappeared, their names stricken from all records as if they had never existed. The message was crystalline in its clarity. Submission was survival, resistance was annihilation. But nothing could truly prepare these girls for the moment when the summons came. Usually it would arrive during a religious festival, adding a layer of ceremonial legitimacy to what was about to occur. The girl would be bathed in sacred waters drawn from specially blessed wells. She would be dressed in elaborate robes of white silk, symbolizing both purity and sacrifice. Gold bracelets were placed on her wrists, not as adornment, but as markers of ownership. And then, accompanied by eunuchs chanting religious hymns, she would be led through the palace corridors toward the king's private chambers. To anyone observing from outside, it might have appeared as a celebration. The girl was being honored with the king's attention, blessed by proximity to divine power. But the girl herself, walking those marble halls, knew the truth. She was walking toward the end of everything she had been and the beginning of a nightmare that would define the rest of her existence. Behind the ornate doors that closed with a sound like thunder, her father waited. And what happened in those chambers, over hours or sometimes days, would transform daughter into possession, princess into property, human being into instrument of royal will. The encounters were documented only in fragments, medical records that spoke in euphemisms about treating royal women for mysterious injuries that required weeks of recovery. But between the lines of these clinical descriptions, the truth screams out across the centuries. This was not love or even desire. This was the assertion of absolute power, the breaking of will, the systematic destruction of identity itself. And when it was finally over, when the doors opened again and the girl emerged, she would not return to the life she had known. She would be moved to a different section of the harem, reserved for women who had been claimed by the king. There she would wait, never knowing when she might be summoned again, caught between the terror of repetition and the strange abandonment of being forgotten. What happened at that first violation was in many ways even more calculated and cruel than the act itself. Because Xerxes understood something that made him perhaps the most dangerous kind of predator. He understood that trauma could be weaponized, that a broken daughter could become the perfect political tool. The daughters who survived their father's chambers entered a second phase of suffering, one that extended far beyond the palace walls and into the furthest reaches of the Persian Empire. Xerxes had discovered a twisted innovation in statecraft. A daughter who had been systematically broken by her own father would make an perfectly compliant wife for ambitious nobles and potentially rebellious military commanders. The trauma was not just an unfortunate byproduct of royal excess. It was the entire point, a feature carefully cultivated and then deployed as an instrument of political control. The marriages were presented as the highest honor. When Xerxes announced that a particular satrap or general would receive a royal daughter as wife, it was framed as recognition of exceptional service to the empire. Elaborate ceremonies were held, religious rites performed, expensive gifts exchanged. To refuse such an honor would be interpreted as an insult to the king himself, potentially fatal to one's career and quite possibly to one's life. So the recipients accepted with public displays of gratitude, while privately understanding exactly what they were receiving, a traumatized young woman who would serve as a permanent reminder of the king's reach and power. These arranged marriages served multiple purposes in Xerxes' intricate web of control. First, they bound powerful men to him through complicity. A commander who accepted a daughter that had been violated by her own father became implicated in that violation. He could never speak against the king's practices without condemning himself. Second, these daughters had been conditioned from their time in the preparation chamber to observe and report everything back to the palace. They were unwitting spies in their husbands' households. Their loyalty to their father violator paradoxically strengthened through trauma bonding and the complete destruction of any other identity or allegiance. Among the many victims of this system, one story survives in fragments that allow us to glimpse the human cost behind the political machinery. Greek historians who had access to Persian court records referred to her by various names, but most sources call her Maestress, though this may have been a title rather than a personal name. She was born around 473 BCE to one of Xerxes' secondary wives, a woman from the distant province of Bactria who had herself been given to the king as part of a political alliance. Amestris's early childhood appears to have been relatively unremarkable by the grim standards of royal life. She played with her siblings in the children's quarters, learned to read Persian and Elamite script, and was by all accounts a bright and curious child. But when she turned 11, everything changed. Court records show her transfer to the preparation chamber, and alongside that notation, a fragment from her mother's correspondence survives. "My daughter was taken from the gardens today. I have taken to my bed and cannot rise. The physicians say I suffer from maternal grief, but I know it is my soul dying in anticipation of what my child must endure." For 2 years, Amestris underwent the systematic conditioning described earlier. But what makes her story uniquely heartbreaking is that fragments of her own words survived, discovered centuries later by archaeologists excavating the ruins of the royal palace. Carved into the walls of her chamber in Old Persian script, barely legible, were prayers and pleas. "Let my breath cease before the sun sets again," one fragment reads. Another, even more devastating, "Mother, why do you dress me in gold for this darkness?" These were not the words of a girl who believed the religious justifications. They were the words of someone who understood exactly what was happening and had no power to stop it. At 13, Amestris was summoned to her father's chambers. The date was recorded because it coincided with the Feast of Mithra, a religious festival celebrating purity and divine light. Greek observers noted this timing with bitter irony, seeing it as emblematic of Persian hypocrisy. What occurred during that encounter is not detailed in any surviving text, but medical records show that Amestris required weeks of recovery afterward for injuries that the court physicians described with carefully neutral language. Unlike many victims who vanished into historical silence, Amestris's story continued because she became pregnant from one of these encounters. The child she bore became a pawn in the succession struggles that followed Xerxes' eventual assassination, and Amestris's position as mother to a potential heir meant she had to be kept alive and relatively visible. This cruel twist of fate, being too valuable to discard, at least ensured that fragments of her story would survive for us to piece together centuries later. Greek historian Ctesias, who spent time at the Persian court and had access to records and first-hand accounts, described Amestris in her 20s as a woman who spoke only when commanded and looked at no one, as if her eyes had been turned inward to some private horror. Servants reported finding her standing motionless for hours, and they were incidents of self-harm, attempts to mar the beauty that had become her curse. But Amestris's ordeal did not end with her father's death. When Xerxes was assassinated in 465 BCE, his son Artaxerxes I claimed the throne and, following Persian custom, claimed his father's women as his own. This included his own half-sisters. Amestris, now in her 20s, found herself subjected to abuse by her own brother, the cycle continuing without pause or mercy. The son she had born to her father was raised in the palace, taught to view his mother as property rather than parent, completing a circle of dehumanization that seems almost incomprehensible in its systematic cruelty. The pattern repeated across generations. Daughters became mothers who were forced to prepare their own daughters for the same fate. The psychological torture of this forced complicity added yet another layer to an already unbearable system. Historical records speak of elaborate preparation rituals where mothers would bathe and dress their daughters, weeping silently as they performed these duties, knowing exactly where the ceremony would lead. Some mothers reportedly lost their minds entirely, unable to reconcile the role of nurturer with the role of enabler. The system was so thoroughly embedded in Persian court culture that it survived Xerxes' death and continued under subsequent rulers. It became a template, a blueprint for absolute power that later empires would study and sometimes emulate. The victims accumulated across the decades, each generation adding new names to a list of suffering that history has tried repeatedly to erase or romanticize into something more palatable. The Persian Empire would eventually fall, conquered by Alexander the Great in 330 BCE, the great palaces were burned, the harems emptied, and the surviving women scattered to fates unknown. The system that had operated for generations came to an abrupt and violent end. But the legacy of what happened in those chambers, behind those golden doors, echoes through history, a reminder of what absolute power can do when completely unchecked. We study ancient Persia for its architectural achievements, its military innovations, its contributions to art and culture, but we cannot fully understand any civilization without acknowledging its darkest corners, the places where power operated without conscience or constraint. The story of Xerxes and his daughters is not a footnote or an aberration. It is a central truth about how systems of absolute authority can transform love into possession, protection into predation, and family itself into a mechanism of control and abuse. These girls had names, they had dreams, they had potential that was systematically destroyed before they ever had a chance to realize it. History tried to forget them, to bury their suffering beneath layers of diplomatic language and romantic mythology. But the archaeological evidence remains, carved into walls, written in medical records, documented by horrified foreign observers. Their voices reach across 2,500 years, demanding that we bear witness, that we remember, and that we never allow such darkness to hide behind the glittering facade of power and glory again. The question that haunts me, and should haunt all of us, how many similar stories remain hidden in the shadows of history, waiting to be acknowledged?